Now, Daniel 9 is my foundation for prophecy. In the last video, I talked about the controversial verse 25. Daniel 9:25 says 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which equals 69 weeks. Then Messiah will be cut off. This is significant. Some scholars believe it's ridiculous to separate 2,000 years between the 69th week and the 70th week to fulfill this prophecy. They say time stops, but it doesn't stop. Oh no, there are a whole lot of promises being fulfilled. Then the verse goes on to say, the end is not yet. I'm going to show you why I believe there is a gap and should be a gap. Because if we start with Jesus Christ at the end of the 69th week, this is God's plan of redemption for the world. It starts here, which is one of the mysteries of the Old Testament. It's God's greatest demonstration of grace on display, and it's not finished yet. The metaphor God uses is how Israel, his wife, and her children commit adultery against him, so he divorces her and adopts other children, and now he wants to find a pure bride to give to his son. This theme is woven throughout scriptures. So what is happening between the 69th week and the 70th week? Well, it's the most momentous event in history. Jesus Christ saved the world at the end of the 69th week. And this theme is continuing now for the last 2,000 years. It's redemption. It's his plan, and it starts with Israel. Now, this is important when we get to the book of Revelation, because it'll connect to this. So we must understand what's happening. Now, when God refers to himself as the husband of Israel, that's in Isaiah 54:5. And then if you read Jeremiah 31:32-33. Now, it talks about a new covenant that God is making with Israel. And a lot of scholars or historians will think Jesus Christ is that new covenant. So as soon as he came, that fulfilled it. And that's why the 70th week ends right there. Now, this, among other things, but this is one of them. But what happened here is the old covenant was made through the Mosaic law as a whole to the nation of Israel, for God to bring himself and the law through the Israelites. The new covenant is more of a reestablishment for individuals and the fulfillment to individuals as opposed to like Israel as a nation. Now, in principle, this covenant, which was announced by Jesus Christ in Luke 22:20, begins to be exercised with spiritual aspects realized for the Jewish and Gentile believers in the church era. And it's begun to take effect during this church age. So this is the new covenant that Jeremiah is talking about. And needless to say, Israel as a nation has rejected this. So it hasn't been completed. Now, notice God calls himself their husband. You can look in Ezekiel 16:11-17. And here God is talking about what he did for Israel, how he adorned her with all kinds of jewels and silver, brought her up among all the nations to be great, and her splendor was on display. But in verse 15, he says, but you trusted in your beauty and played the harlot because of your fame, and you poured out your harlotries on every passerby who might be willing. You took some of your clothes made for yourself, high places of various colors, and played the harlot on them. And it goes on like that. This is what Israel kept doing to God, who God refers to Israel as his wife. She was committing adultery over and over. You see, Israel was unfaithful. She prostituted herself. And this is the nation that God chose to reveal himself and his pre-designed plan of redemption to our fallen world. Look what God says in Jeremiah 3:1. If a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not the land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers. yet you turn to me. So even after she goes to other people, she keeps turning back to God. And he's saying, should I keep taking Israel back? And remember, the metaphor is Israel, the mother, the wife, and the sons. And if you go to verse 14, he says, return, O faithless sons, declares the Lord, for I am a master to you, and I will take you, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. He keeps telling them promises if they would just not go against him and reject him. And he uses as an example the prophet Hosea. Look at Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. So he's telling the prophet, before he'd send a prophet into Israel, he would show the prophet by giving them examples of what Israel was doing to him. And then in Hosea chapter 2, verses 2 through 7, he says, contend with your mother, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And let her put away her harlotry from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts. Or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day of when she was born. So he's saying she needs to stop this. God is continually showing his mercy and his grace to this adulterous wife, Israel. But eventually, God has enough. Look at Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 6. But she has rebelled against my ordinances more wickedly than the nations, and against my statutes more than the lands which surround her. So God is letting Israel go. If you move to verse 13, thus my anger will be spent, and I will satisfy my wrath on them, and I will be appeased. Then they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal, when I have spent my wrath upon them. Moreover, I will make you a desolation and a reproach among the nations which surround you, in the sight of all who pass by. Now, a lot of people say the 70th week was fulfilled when the Romans destroyed the temple, but that is not true. Since the Roman times, though, the Jews have lost their homeland. They were rejected among the nations. They had no city, they had no land, they had no sanctuary. That went on for like 1,500 years, but you'll see, obviously, we know now they came back to their land, but nobody knew that back then. And that's one of the miracles that happened between the 69th and 70th week. And it goes on here in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. And then it goes on to talk about Judah, how he still was putting up with Judah. Because remember, Israel, the northern kingdom, was dispersed first, and Judah stuck around here during these Roman times and stuff. She's going to last a little longer, and then they're going to be dispersed. But God basically divorces Israel. But remember, this is all part of his plan of redemption. And he's given it to us in this kind of metaphor so that our human minds can understand or have some understanding what's happening. Now in Romans chapter 11, verse 11, he says, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? This is Paul, he's talking about Israel. May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? So, what we're saying here is God is not done with Israel. Yeah, he rejected them. Yeah, he threw them. And you're going to find scholars that say God is done with Israel. He rejected them, but that's not true. He is not done with them. That's why the 70th week has not been fulfilled yet. He is not done with Israel. Why would he be trying to make them jealous if he was done with them? Now look at Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5. He predestined us to adoption. Remember, this has all been laid out. God knew all this in the beginning. That's why this was a plan that he had to save the world. He predestined us to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intention of his will. Okay, remember, he's all doing this because he loved the world. That's why he's saving us. But he is now adopting the rest of the world because Israel rejected him. Now let's go to Romans chapter 11, verse 25. I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. Remember, I said it's a mystery because the Old Testament prophets didn't know who the person was and who they were talking about with Jesus Christ and how he had to suffer to save this world. But now it's not a mystery because Jesus Christ came and the apostles preached and Paul preached. We understand it now. But that's why he says, I do not want you to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. There it is, the fullness of the Gentiles. Look, Paul says because the Jews rejected God, we the Gentiles received God's gift of salvation, but the Jews aren't forgotten. God isn't done with them. He still made promises to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he must fulfill, and he hasn't done that yet. Remember, the plan was always to save the whole world. He is not done saving Israel. So God's metaphor of a husband divorcing his unfaithful wife and adopting new children is something that we are to use to understand his purpose. And now he's using the same metaphor for his son Jesus and the church as his bride. After the 69th week, Jesus died, was buried, rose, and started his church, the bride of Christ. Meanwhile, the Jews are being blinded by the truth and driven to be jealous because the Gentiles now accept their God's Son as their Savior. We are being tried, tested, and purified to find true believers that will be the bride of Christ. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might be sanctified her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. And in Matthew chapter 9, verse 14, Jesus Christ refers to himself as the bridegroom. Well, who's the bride? The church. It says, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. So he calls himself the bridegroom. And look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. God is saying, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, for I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. You see the term he used here, betrothal, because in the Jewish days, young kids, when they were born, they could be betrothed to each other, and they can be in the betrothal period for 15 years before they got married. And during that time, the bride would make herself worthy, and the husband would go and prepare a place for his family. This is the idea and the concept that Scripture always puts through. It's just there. It's through all the Gospels and the Bible that we are in a betrothal period. The 69th and 70th week is a betrothal period where the church is proving herself to be pure. We all must be purged, refined, and found true. This is what's happening at this time. The clock hasn't stopped, it's still moving. And so the next question is, why is it taking so long for the 70th week to take place? And we find these answers in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4 and 8 and 9. And it says, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of its coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. And then in 8, but do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. It's to our benefit he's taken a while. That's just the bottom line. There's really no more explanation needed for that. And the last one is Romans again, chapter 11. Remember, he's talking about Israel here and how they rejected God and how the Gentiles are now accepted and taken into the olive tree and being grafted in. And if we go to 23, it says, "Behold then the kindness and the severity of God to those who fell, severity, but to you God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off." Remember, he cut off Israel. "And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again." Everybody can be taken back. Israel be grafted back in to eternal life if they believe in God. That's the new covenant, a spiritual believing, not by the Mosaic law, which is what they still do today. This gap between the 69th and 70th week is very, very important for the plan of redemption. So basically, there's two schools of thought, and that is my belief that the 70th week has not happened yet. But in future videos here that I'm putting up, we'll try to figure out when it will take place. And you'll see when we get to the book in Revelation that this gap period is the sixth empire on the dragon's head. And now we're going to talk about Daniel chapter 2, in which the fourth empire is this gap period. It took me 16 minutes to explain the way the theme here goes. The gap between the 69th and 70th week is the church age, the betrothal period, the grace period. This is where all the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles is being fulfilled. And we're going to see that term being used again too. Meanwhile, Israel still follows the Mosaic law, even though they don't even have a temple anymore. They just got their homeland back, 60 years ago. And that was a miracle. And that's even in scriptures. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's look at Daniel 2. Daniel gets a vision, and it's a statue. And the statue represents four empires or kingdoms. We get that from the text. Then it says, Babylon is the head. The chest is a different empire, and it doesn't name it yet. And the waist is a different empire, and it doesn't name that yet. And then it says there is a fourth one, and it doesn't name that one either. Now in verse 33, it states that the fourth empire are the legs and are of iron, and the feet are partly clay and partly iron. Then a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the feet made of iron and clay, and it crushed all the empires. So Daniel goes on to say the same things, as what he saw, but he adds a little more detail. And he says that King Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. But again, the next empire is not mentioned by name, as well as the third one either. But starting in verse 40, it says there will be a fourth kingdom. This is the one we're really interested in, and the one I'd like to discuss. It says it'll be as strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all others. In verse 41, I think this is significant because now it mentions toes. And it says as the toes are partly of iron and partly of clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile. And then in 43 it says, as you saw iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the day of those kings, and what kings are they talking about? They're talking about during the 10 toes. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, remember what I said about prophecy. People reading this, even like 50 years after Daniel wrote it, would not even know what he was talking about. You couldn't make sense of this stuff until it happened, and only if you studied a written history of the facts. Now, we know now, or have a really good idea, what kingdoms Daniel is talking about and what has taken place in history. But for now, I just want to stick with the context of the text and see what unfolds as we're reading it, like for the first time. Now, I'll come back to chapter 2. For now, let's move to chapter 7. Now, in 7, Daniel has another vision. And the vision is about four beasts. And these four beasts, obviously, should take our mind right back to Daniel 2 about the four empires on the statue. Now, in this vision, the first was like a lion and had wings of an eagle. We already know on the statue the head was Babylon. So here in 7, it goes on to describe more about Babylon's greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar, which we know what happened to him, and we don't have to get into all that. Now in verse 5, behold, another beast, a second one resembling a bear. So this gives more details of the second beast, and in Daniel 2, the statue, the second beast, was the breast of silver. Now in 7, it's a bear. It's talking about the same empire with different details. Then in verse 6, after this, I kept looking at another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The symbolisms here give us clues about the empires. The leopard is very fast. The wings mean very fast or swiftness. The statue in Daniel 2, that third empire, was the groin area, the bronze. These are the same empires. Now after this, I kept looking, and behold, a fourth beast. Now this is back in chapter 7. And this terminology is the same as the fourth empire of the statue in Daniel about the legs of iron. Notice it uses the same descriptions here, like dreadful, terrifying, and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts before it. But it changes something here. Remember, the statue in Daniel 2 went down to the feet and 10 toes, and in Daniel 7, it says, and it had 10 horns. But immediately, my mind goes right back to the 10 toes. These are the same references. The 10 horns, it's the same idea, it's just referred to in this version with a different symbol. And then we get more detail of what's going on when you get to the 10 horns. In verse 8, it says, while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. And then it goes on to tell about God creating his kingdom like it did in chapter 2, that rock being cut out of the mountain that crushes all. That's God's kingdom. He comes down and smashes it all. Now, starting in verse 11, then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. And I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Now, I'm not going to go over what all this means yet. I just wanted to read it as if we were reading Daniel's book for the first time and we want to follow the text. So all we know so far is that the first kingdom in both these visions are Babylon. And then there are going to be 3 more that come after Babylon. Now, because we're so far in the future, we really do know who these are. But let's just keep reading. Because when you get to verse 15, Daniel really wants to know what's happening with this fourth empire. So in verse 17, it says, these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings which will arise from the earth. So these empires can represent kings, which would be the most prominent, strongest kings ruling their empires. And it says, but the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come. So every time God brings judgment, he always lets us know that the saints are going to prevail and overcome and have everlasting life. And that's all he's trying to say here, that even though these terrible beasts who represent kingdoms, that means they're predators. They're nothing nice here. They are predatory, every one of these empires. Even though they come and do terrible things, God and his saints will overcome in the end. Now in verse 19, he says, I want to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others. And again, here's the same descriptions. He uses like exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And then Daniel goes on. He wants to know the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boast, and was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, Daniel says, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints. So Daniel gets an answer here of what this means. And the vision says in verse 23, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. And there's going to rise 10 kingdoms from it. And another horn is going to come up, and he will be different from the previous ones, and he will subdue 3 of those kings. And he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law. And they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. So we learn a lot more here. And we wonder now who this little horn is. This horn, to me, resembles Daniel chapter 9, the future prince of the people who's to come. But we get more detail about this horn. So we're going to get into the little horn in a little bit. What I want to discuss here is time, times, and half a time. Now remember, Daniel's 70th week. In the middle of that week, which is 3.5 years, something happens. Well, time, times, and a half a time is one way that the Jews used to record their years because they didn't have a clock. So a time to them was one full harvest year. It would start from spring and go to spring. That would be 1 year or a time. So basically it would be 1 year as we would count it. So it says for a time and then times. So that's plural. That means 2 more seasons or years. So we would count it 2 more years. So that's 3 years. And then it says half a time. So that would be half a year. So there it is. It's saying 3.5 years. So this person is allowed to do damage for 3.5 years. So now, to me, this directly connects us to Daniel chapter 9, the 70th week. That's going to be split in half, 3.5 years. So what do we know? Number 1, a great and terrible empire devours the whole earth. 2, then 10 kingdoms come out of this empire. Remember the 10 toes in chapter 2 and the 10 horns in chapter 7. Number 3, another horn, this is a person specifically, will rise out of them and subdue 3 of them. Number 4, this person will magnify himself as a god and destroy many saints. Number 5, he will destroy many for 3.5 years. And number 6, God will come and stop him and set up his kingdom. Now, all this comes out of the fourth empire on the earth. So let's find out exactly what this empire is or who it is and all the empires that we're talking about here. And to help us with this, let's go to Daniel chapter 8. It talks about some more animals, goats and rams. Now, we don't need to get into details of those animals, but they do have horns. So it's the same terminology that we're reading in chapter 7. Now, the reason I believe they use beasts in chapter 7 and animals here in 8 is because Israel would be familiar with animals because they have rituals and sacrifices which had to do with goats, lambs, bulls, and there was other animals that they wouldn't even be allowed to eat. So I think it would be very familiar to Israel reading about animals. Now, as for horns, I think this makes a connection to the horns in chapter 7. That's why we're reading about horns here. Look, because I don't believe chapter 8 here about Persia and Greece and these horns is simply to tell Daniel what his people are going to go through. It's to let all of us know what's going to happen at the end times. That's why they're using the same horn reference. Now, if we skip to verse 20, it gives us the identity of the ram. It's Media and Persia. The goat is Greece. So now, of the 4 empires they mention, from the statue and the 4 beasts, we know 3 of them now: Babylon, Persia, and Greece. The 4th empire is never mentioned, and I'll just tell you right now, it's never mentioned by name. And I find that rather odd. They name the other 3, why wouldn't they just name Rome and say Rome came next? Because as you can see by the description they're giving it, it's not considered the same type of empire as the other ones. It didn't come and fall like the other ones did one after another. And I believe also that this 4th empire encompasses more than just Rome of the ancient world. Now, this is pure conjecture on my part, but then again, I'm asking why wouldn't they just call it Rome? But they never mention it by name. And it's because I believe it's different from the other empires that came and went. And also, I might add in Daniel chapter 7, verse 12, where it says, "As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time." So you see, these empires, they all lost their chief dominance when they were conquered in history. Each one was then amalgamated into the empire that came after it. And Rome actually amalgamated all three of these, and that's why it says their dominion was taken away, but they have been given an extension of life for an appointed period of time. That appointed period of time is always in the future, as far as I'm concerned, when we're referring to. We are living in an empire that encompasses all of these great four empires of the world. I believe Rome came, and it's still, our world is still identified as a Romanized world, and I'll get more into that. Now, all we know is that Daniel describes it as a beast worse than all the others. It's terrifying, devours, crushes all, strong as iron, has iron teeth, and there's just a reason why it isn't labeled, okay? It encompasses more than just a single empire. Now, let's go on back to chapter 8 and verse 8, and it says, "Then the male goat magnified itself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and then in its place came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven." Now we know that this was Alexander the Great's empire, which was broken up among his 5 generals, but eventually went to 4 generals. So now we're getting more detail of what's happening here concerning Israel. I believe every detail is put here for a reason. It's for the end times also. These horns, which are powerful people, are forerunners of things to come at the end time. Horns here should point us to the other horns, because if you study the Bible, you'll see the theme throughout the Bible, the stories, examples, which always leads us to the future of God's plan, namely Jesus Christ, who was to come. Everything that happens in the Old Testament and all the Jews' ritual and everything they had to do pointed to Jesus Christ. Their laws they had to follow, their sacrifices, they all pointed to him. Therefore, when we read about these horns, they are forerunners which also point to this future prince in the end times. The information about these horns are important because what they are doing is what the future horn of Revelation, or this prince that we talked about in Daniel 9, is going to be doing. So these are details we can follow like a map, so we can recognize the future prince. And we get some details about this future prince in verse 9. Don't get me wrong here. We are talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, but this is a forerunner of what the future prince is going to do. And so it says, out of one of them what? Well, they're talking about out of one of the horns of Alexander's empire, came forth a rather small horn, which grew up exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and trampled them down, and even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. It removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down, and on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. And it goes on to say how long this will go on about the regular sacrifice, while the transgression causes horrors, as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled. And the angel said, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. So we know from history this is Antiochus Epiphanes. He went into Jerusalem, he took out his anger on the Jews, he killed a bunch of them, and notice what it says, because on the account of their transgression. Okay, then he took away their laws and their sacrifices. He committed the abomination of desolation, a horrible act, and sacrificed pigs and poured pig's blood on the sanctuary altar, and he even put a statue of Zeus on the altar, which of course resembled himself. Now he did all this, and this is what the future prince is going to do to the Jews at the end times, which we're going to get into. Now, the 2,300 evenings and mornings are 2,300 days. Antiochus IV Epiphanes installed as the high priest of the Jews Menelaus, who bribed Antiochus for the position, and this was in 171. Then the abomination was committed, and it wasn't restored until 164, which was about 6 years and a little more. And 2,300 evenings and mornings is 6.3 years. So that's all they're talking about, is they're giving details of Antiochus here, but believe me, we can look to the future prince doing the same thing. Then the holy place was restored because, the Maccabean revolt restored it, and that's where they get Hanukkah from. So the future horn that comes after the 10 horns is going to do the same thing. So in case you haven't noticed, these horns, these little horns, are not good people. They are people who destroy the Jews, and they commit the abomination of desolation. We also see that the fourth empire is not named, but of course 99% of all theologians believe it to be Rome, and so do I, because the statue in Daniel 2 says it was a divided kingdom, which was labeled as the legs of the statue. And yes, Rome was divided between east and west when it said it formed into the feet, partly of clay and iron, and tried to mingle with the seed of men, but cannot. To me, that's what happened after the Roman Empire became weakened and not unified any longer. You notice I didn't say fall or conquered, because as it goes into the feet, it's still made of iron, just like the legs of iron. That's the Roman territory. Even the 10 toes are of iron, only it's mixed with clay now because it's not unified. It's not under a central government. It's not as strong anymore. And chapter 2, verse 43, it says, "And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery." All the kingdoms that were set up that came out of the Roman Empire all over Europe, Asia, and Asia Minor, these kings and queens, they tried to marry off their royal bloodlines throughout all these kingdoms to unite and become strong, but none of it worked. They couldn't unite under one ruler, and they were still separate. Hence, some of the kingdoms were strong as iron and some were weak as clay, and they could not adhere together. Now, as a side note, before World War I, every ruling family of the nations in Europe were all related in one way or another. Now, at the feet, we move into the 10 toes, which some are weak and some are strong as iron. And then from here, we can go to Daniel chapter 7 about the beast. Okay, the 10 horns come out of this fourth beast, Rome, which is the same as the 10 toes. And this Romanized world forms into these 10 kingdoms. And then a little horn comes up and subdues 3 of them. And then he fights against the saints and magnifies himself as God. And we know from chapter 8 that Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn there. But the other little horn that comes out of these 10 kingdoms haven't happened yet. It's in the future. But the reason they give us the story of Antiochus is because this other horn's going to do the same thing at the end. And that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we will finish the book of Daniel with chapter 11, because in chapter 11, it makes a direct connection between Antiochus Epiphanes and the future king. So these 2 horns will now be shown to be, in my opinion, directly connected.